Okay, thanks very much for the introduction. I'd probably just like to preempt this presentation with the fact that this really is based on my observations from working in and on behalf of a number of councils for the last 15 years. And it's also probably more to do about raising some questions, and I'm not suggesting that I have all the answers to. So if you ask me questions at the end, I'm not promising much. So as we've already heard today, yes, waste dialogue is happening. Within the waste sector itself, there's been a number of things that have happened within the last 12 to 18 months. The container deposit scheme is now available in 5 states and territories across Australia. The single-use plastic bag ban, uptaken by many retailers, has then led to other initiatives around single-use plastics, such as Straws No More, and many councils have taken that a step further with banning balloons, plastic water bottles and plastic bags at many of their events. Then obviously there's the war on waste that premiered in May 2017 and was an unprecedented success in focusing on the impacts and solutions to material waste in Australia. David Attenborough's Blue Planet resulted in the Queen banning straws in the palace and Prince Charles no longer using tea bags because of its plastic component. And then in mid-April this year, there was a 60 Minutes that had an expose on Australia's packaging industry and were accused of sensationalistic journalism and biased reporting. I think regardless of what we all believe, and while not all publicity is good or possibly accurate, I think what it has caused and what Costa would refer to as disturbance within the industry and has certainly sparked waste-related conversations across the country. And then, we're going to get sick of this by the end of the next 3 days, I think, but there was the Chinese national sword policy and the ban on exports of Australia's recyclable packaging, which is apparently about to be followed suit now by India and Indonesia. And while there's no doubt this has caused and continues to cause a waste management headache for many in the industry, it has also served to highlight existing issues with Australia's waste and recycling policies and reignited much-needed discussions around the need to support and invest in the sector's growth and create jobs and transition to a circular economy, as we heard this morning. There was an ABC News article in April this year. The federal government were accused of inaction and dragging their feet. Councils are being forced to stockpile. A few brave souls are starting to create recyclable markets within their own backyards. At the very bottom of this article, in the very last paragraph, it was suggested that recycling starts at home and that the biggest challenge is getting our residents to use their bins responsibly. And isn't this point critical to the whole article? Unless we change people's perceptions of waste and waste management behaviours, any future Australian markets will be flooded with the same substandard products. So what does this mean for waste educators? In 1975, Canterbury Council became the first Australian municipality to start separating recyclables from household waste. In 2019, more than 90% of Australian households now have curbside recycling. A large percentage of waste education budgets still remain targeted on recycling, and we have been delivering what we would term best practice recycling messages to our communities for the last 20 plus years. However, while the industry may have evolved in that time, I would argue that the overarching approaches to waste education have remained relatively unchanged. The result is that this remains an all too familiar sight on curbsides across Australia. So do we need to question whether we are truly engaging with our communities? Are our messages getting through? And do we need to reconsider our approach to waste education in light of recent events and disturbances within the industry? And just as importantly, do we also need to acknowledge and question the attitudes and behaviours that lead to these outcomes? Where are our communities at? There is no doubt a feeling of complacency within our communities. This is how I've always done it. My bin gets emptied regardless. And isn't there also a sense of entitlement? It's my bin, I pay for it, it's up to me how I use it. And so our challenge as waste educators, I would argue, is how do we respond to these embedded attitudes effectively? How do we build or rebuild the trust that has been lost? And how do we change the habits And this is where we lead into behaviour change, which has been mentioned a number of times already today. It's obvious that education will not be effective unless we understand the community's behaviours. We need to start to assess what factors influence their behaviours, the barriers and motivators, as well as making clear our expectations of the preferred behaviour. We also need to remember that it is never too late to align our programmes with the principles of behaviour change. People always think they need to look at behaviour change at the outset of a project. It is never too late to start adopting principles of behaviour change. On the slide now, there's just one framework. There are many, many more out there. For example, there is the method Behaviour Works Australia, a very, very good behaviour change model. There's the EAST framework by Behavioural Insights Unit UK. There's Behaviour Change Wheel by Combi. There's Community-Based Social Marketing by Doug Mackenzie Moore. And I would encourage you to look at all of these when you're considering your waste education programs. And when we think about that, we also need to consider, in addition to behaviour change, what lessons can we learn from the approaches that we have traditionally taken to waste education in the past. If we think of successful and powerful behaviour change campaigns, just to name a few, for example, the hosepipe ban during periods of drought, drink driving campaigns, the quit smoking campaigns, there's a very obvious link in all of those between people's actions and its impact and consequences. Waste, on the other hand, is very much out of sight, out of mind. And maybe we're not always as transparent in our communications as we could be. Waste management and processing is an invisible process and very intangible for most. Waste generation happens behind closed doors. It's presented on the curbside in a solid bin, and it's then collected and buried in a big hole in the ground, not accessible by very many. There is an obvious level of disconnect between people's actions and its impact. There is therefore less of a motivation to change behaviours if people cannot see, experience, or appreciate the impact and consequences of their behaviours. This is why, for those councils who are fortunate enough to run land or MRF tours, these are such powerful and effective motivators for change. The second one is the incentives. Where are the incentives for behaviours? I've got three scenarios for you. If bins are emptied on a regular basis, regardless of whether they have been used responsibly or irresponsibly, where is the incentive to change the behaviour? Both behaviours, desired and undesired, are responded to in the same way. The second scenario, if someone thinks they are doing the right thing and this thought is being reflected or supported by an action, i.e. their bin is being emptied, then why would they actively seek out to change their behaviour? The third scenario, there's a people who know right from wrong, but for a variety of reasons, choose not to practice their knowledge. Getting people to practice what they know can be one of the hardest things to do. Doug Mackenzie Moore would call this the power of social diffusion. It's probably a polite way of saying peer pressure, where societal expectations lead to a new behaviour becoming a social norm. I say, bring on the see-through recycling bins. And as has been alluded to earlier today as well, all too often waste education programmes are delivered on very tight budgets, bowing to the pressures of political influence, with the same messages often being delivered in a different wrapping. A blanket approach to waste education is not always effective. The pressure for waste educators is often to do a little bit of everything, rather than focus on one thing and do that really, really well. Making the effort to customise our programmes can lead to more effective outcomes. No one knows your community as well as you do. What is the behaviour or the behaviours that you want to change? Are you truly understanding your communities and developing targeted programs that meet their needs and expectations? Or is it easier to make assumptions about what communities know and don't know because that's how we've always done it? For example, bin inspection programs, while they are very labour intensive and high cost when compared to other approaches, they do address behaviours at the curbside. And this data can then be used to develop customised and targeted education and interventions. In addition, the bin inspection programs can actually incentivise people to change their behaviours because their behaviours are being identified specific to themselves. And then we come to our messaging. So it's not just a matter of identifying our messages, but also considering the methods in which we deliver these messages. So we think about most recycling messaging. Is our language connecting with our target audience? So, for example, take most recycling brochures. On one single brochure, there will be the following messages. Do, don't. Yes, no. Stop, go. Can, can't. Don't bag, loose items, flatten boxes, rinse, don't rinse, lids off, lids on, empty, flatten, squash, stack. Which message is your community supposed to take on board? And I appreciate that part of the issue here is a lack of consistency across the industry. Then we come to our terminology, and the waste industry is full of fairly confusing terms. Resource recovery, contamination, residual waste, commingled, resource diversion, waste hierarchy. And then don't start me on the acronyms. MRF, MGP, C&I, C&D, MSW, MUD, SUD, RRC, PPR, WTF. Oh. Sorry, don't record that bit. And so what this illustrates really is that there is a need for simple, consistent, and reiterated messages that could get delivered across a range of formats, mediums, and platforms, because not everyone gets their information from one source. This is a Google search when you put in recycling in Australia. This is one page. There were 20 pages. This is a couple of other councils' approach to their messaging. How refreshingly honest. How effective. And then while we're on messaging, in September 2018, the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation launched the Australasian Recycling Label, designed to inform consumers of the correct packaging disposal methods. WAMA responded to this that this was a missed opportunity and argues that the label needs to solve two problems. Not only tell consumers how to dispose of waste, but whether the packaging is made from recycled Australian content. So in mid-April this year, WAMA then launched a request for artwork for the Made with Australian Recycled Material label, in the hope that this would help consumers consider their options. As educators, are these additional messages we now need to also consider and be sharing and providing to our communities. So this comes down to being strategic, and are we truly being strategic? EnviroCom works on behalf of a number of clients in developing a more strategic approach to annual and longer-term waste education plans. There can be no doubt that waste dialogue is happening within the community, and now is the time to act. We can't just sit by and let this move on. It really is not a matter of discounting the educational approaches of the past, but being able to critically assess and evaluate these approaches. Learning from past experiences allows us to adapt a more strategic, targeted and innovative approach to education that truly relates and engages with the needs and expectations of our local communities. Education plays a critical role within the waste sector. It has taken a long time for waste education to be taken seriously by the sector, but done well, it is a powerful tool for community change. So based on the current climate, what comes next? Late last year, the New South Wales Government released its draft New South Wales Circular Economy Policy, taking the first steps in transitioning from a take, make, dispose approach to a model that embraces circular economy principles. As you can see, the seventh key principle in their draft policy is fostering behaviour change through education and engagement. This yet again highlights the value of education as a key driver for change. But is this now the next challenge facing waste educators? I'm done. We as waste educators or the communities? look, I think... I think the community is a bit lost, to be honest. I think we are bombarding our community with many, many messages, and there is some confusion, and because there is a lack of consistency across the sector too, there is very many mixed messages. And so for a community, it's not about them doing a worse job, it's just about them being confused by what is the right thing to do. And that confusion then leads to, it's too hard, which then leads to the idea of complacency, because it becomes too hard. And the issue being is that in the end, you know, that the waste being generated and is being disposed of regardless of their behaviours. And we need to break that cycle, because until we address that, until we actually address the fact that any behaviour is treated the same way, then I think the question of whether we're doing better or worse is very hard to answer. I think most councils develop and deliver programs across, I would argue, across demographics. So we have a lot of waste education programs, we deliver community workshops. I think the key thing is the lack of consistency and just these messages being very, very complicated. And also that we make a lot of assumptions about what people know and about how they act, and that everyone generates waste in a very different way within their home, and that the waste is generated in the kitchen, not at the recycling bin. So we put a sticker on the top of a recycling bin, but we're actually not addressing the waste generation behaviours that happen in the household. So when that behaviour happens in the household, by the time they get out to their recycling bin, the behaviour's already taken place. And so we need to be focusing on waste generation behaviours within the home, and we need to be targeting our messages to address a specific thing. So if, for example, plastic bag contamination in recycling bin is the biggest issue, then why isn't the key focus of our annual campaigns just on getting rid of plastic bags in recycling bins? Yep. Absolutely. 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 Yeah. 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 And that's what I was saying about the transparency. So at the moment it is very intangible because we don't allow people onto our landfills anymore for workplace health and safety. Very few MRFs now do tours, and so people just have no appreciation of those processes. And without that appreciation of those processes, they find it very hard then to understand the impacts of their behaviours. And so really I would argue that in this case the why is as important as the how, so that we actually explain why, what happens to that, how hard councils are working to manage their waste effectively, and what an important role they play as individuals is a fundamental part of that jigsaw puzzle. Claddy? Oh, sorry. Yeah, I agree. I think the challenge is that that's always been, recycling has been a fairly safe area, and because people have a recycling bin, it's also something that we can measure and assess. Avoidance, reduce and reuse are very, very powerful messages, but how do we actually measure and assess that within a household? And I think the argument always that if people can't recycle right, then how on earth are they going to do avoidance and reduction. And that could not be an argument, I'm not sure. But maybe it will. Maybe that should be the focus. But at the moment, certainly, and in the current climate, the conversation is around recycling. And I think we would be silly not to jump on that bandwagon and maybe talk about the positive messaging to counteract some of this negative messaging that's coming out of the media. Oh, look, I think historically, and having worked in the council previously, we struggled very hard to get a waste education budget across the line. So when councils were reconfiguring their budgets, waste education was always the one that was crossed off, because education was seen as being quite fluffy, quite warm, talking to the kids in schools, and wasn't really seen as a driver for change. And I think I would say that in the last 15 years that I've been within the industry, that has changed, that education is now, and especially with this idea around behaviour change and education being a very powerful motivator for change, that the industry itself has suddenly seen education as being quite critical, a critical cog within the greater wheel. Thank you very much.